Welcome to Quintessential Conversations. In today's episode, we will explore ecosophy and climate change. Today, we have Aseem Shrivastava with us. Aseem Shrivastava is a Delhi-based writer, teacher, and ecological thinker. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He currently teaches courses on global and Indian ecosophy at Ashoka University. He taught philosophy at Nordic College, Norway from 2001 to 2005. Since 2005, he has been working, researching, writing, and lecturing nationally and internationally on issues associated with globalization and its multiple ecological and other impacts. He has co-authored the books Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India, published under Penguin Viking in New Delhi in 2012, and Prithvi Mamtat, published under Rajkamal Prakashan in New Delhi in 2016. Aseem writes regularly for many national publications and is also currently at work on a set of 3 books, tentatively called Shrishti Sutra, which brings Rabindranath Tagore's spiritual and ecological vision into dialogue with the ecological challenges of 21st century modernity.
Professor, I think the first question which we are all very enthusiastic to know about is ecosophy, right? So ecosophy is a fairly new term to us and many of our listeners. So could you just broadly explain what ecosophy is and how is it relevant to approaching today's ecological crisis?
Right. First of all, thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to speak to your school and other listeners. Well, if you look at the public discourse around you today, there are 2 standard ways in which ecological issues are discussed, right? One is what one might call environmentalism, and the other is ecology. Let's first try to understand what these are, what these terms mean, how are they different from each other, and then that will help us understand ecosophy, right? Now, we all realize, I think, that the world is ruled today by technocracy. By technocracy, I mean that not only is technology in command of our lives, as we notice, for instance, with Zoom or with the coronavirus or so many other things, it's also that decision makers in today's world are significantly either technocrats themselves, people like, for instance, Elon Musk and Bill Gates and so on, or they're influenced by them, that is to say politicians who are influenced by technocrats. Now, technocrats acknowledge that there are serious ecological problems of the world, climate change being the most significant one. There's also biodiversity loss, there's plastics in the oceans, air pollution, and so on. However, their view is that these problems can be solved within the present framework that exists in the world. So what is that framework? Well, that framework is technocracy, and environmentalism is the way that a technocrat would solve these problems, right? In other words, you accept the ways of the market. If you don't like the market, then bring in the government, and that's about it. So you keep going from the market to the state, from the state to the market, and that's how you tackle environmental issues. When I was trained as an economist 30 years ago, that's what they used to teach, and they still teach the same in environmental economics. So that's environmentalism, at least mainstream environmentalism. There are, of course, non-corporate varieties of environmentalism, and they would hate to be described as technocrats if you lump them with corporate environmentalism. So one should make those fine grades of distinction. What is ecology? Now, ecology is technically a science, right? It studies ecosystems, it studies organisms in relation to their environment. It is a relatively non-reductionist science. That is to say, it looks at multiple variables interacting together. So it's a complex science. It's a life science, and it studies biological entities in their complex interrelationships, and it acknowledges that there is, not only acknowledges, it highlights that there is a web of life to which not only plants and animals, but human beings belong. And there are clear principles along which this web of life is organized. And we are not allowed to violate these principles beyond the point. whereas environmentalism would not always acknowledge that. Environmentalism has a lot of faith in the brilliance of the human mind. So if you look at the IBM tagline, it says, let's build a smarter planet. Now that cannot come from an ecologist, however, it can come from a technocrat environmentalist. As if it's the planet which is stupid, and human beings with their systems will outwit a dumb planet and create a smarter one. And if we cannot, then we can dump on the planet and travel to Mars and find ourselves a better way to live, right? So that's the sort of framework in which the brain operates. Now, what is common to both these is what I call a cosmology. That is to say, a way of looking at life in the universe, in which, for instance, something like space travel is a great desirable, especially for technocrats, right? And there's a good many environmentalists who think that it's perfectly all right to mine the moon, right? To draw minerals from the moon, bring them to Earth, and put them into our mobile phones or our whatever the batteries are that run our mobile phones or electric vehicles. And that is seen to save us from climate change because, you know, fossil fuels contribute to climate change. If you can get the right metals, nickel or cobalt or, I don't know, molybdenum or something from the moon, why not, right? Now let me come to Ecosophy. Ecosophy sets all this aside and says what is fundamentally wrong with the world as it's functioning is our worldview, right? Our worldview is actually problematic. It is at odds with realities over which we have marginal control, and beyond that we have no control, okay? So it critiques the cosmology in which we are, you know, accepting progress in terms of technological development, heading towards space travel, colonizing Moon and Mars, and so on. And it says the problem is that we are actually running away from the problem. Okay, so we use the word solutionism, right? So what is solutionism? Solutionism is an impatient attitude towards problems without understanding them in their full scale, depth, complexity, and causes. We look for solutions. And we even find them in the sense that we find something which works as a palliative or a postponing device for some time before the problem returns in a more vicious form, such as a second wave of the coronavirus, right? And then you look for a solution to that, and you create a booster vaccine or something like that, right? So problem solution, okay, is not going to get us out of the matrix of the overall crisis, right? Ecosophy takes this into account. You can define it, and I'm going to use the definition given by a philosopher theologian who is a big name in theology and in the philosophy of religion, but not very well known in India, although he is half Indian. Raimundo Panikkar, who had a Keralite father and a Catalan Spanish mother, and lived most of his life in Spain. And the definition he gives for ecosophy is the wisdom of the earth. The wisdom of the earth. Now that sounds rather loose, but it can be made more precise. Even though ecosophy is not a science, it does not mean ecosophy is anti-scientific, to be perfectly clear, but ecosophy itself believes more in the experience of nature rather than experimenting with nature, which science does, right? You see the difference between experience and experiment, right? So Panikkar's definition I accept, with one addition. I would say that what has gone wrong in modernity, and which is what has led to the massive ecological crisis of the whole earth now, is that the idea of the home has increasingly eroded. It's become very weak now. So the wisdom of the earth as home, right, is fundamentally what ecosophy is framed in. That is the perspective from where ecosophy begins. So I can, elaborate on this later, maybe in some other context. But the alienation from the earth which makes us forget that the earth is home. And by the earth, I don't mean just this image of this sphere, which we get from pictures from satellites and rockets from outer space. I mean, what's outside this window. When you touch a plant or look at an animal grazing on a pasture, or you look at mountains or oceans, real things, trees, banyans, people, neem, etc., earth. Very different notion of earth from the modern, space sort of picture of the earth. So that's a picture of the earth from the outside, whereas this is a picture or an experience of the earth from the inside. You are here, and just like you can't step outside yourself to see yourself, or with some difficulty you can, as you're doing now with Zoom, right? But normally, God hasn't given us the faculties to have two eyes over here with which to see these, right? Likewise, with some difficulty, we are able to take pictures of the earth from the outside. But remember, no matter what picture you take of the earth from the outside, it will be a limited vision, because it's a 360-degree, three-dimensional sphere of gigantic size. You can't possibly have pictures of every possible dimension and angle on the earth, right? So Ecosophy in that sense is trying to resurrect the idea of the earth as home, and in general trying to resurrect the idea of the home. After all, you can have liberty, fraternity, equality, and all the great ideals of the European Enlightenment fulfilled by everybody staying in hotel rooms. Why not put everybody in hotel suites? A 7-star luxury hotel. Let's assume that's possible for the whole population of the world. Let's assume for a minute. Would that be a desirable world? What would be wrong with it? What would be wrong with it is that there is no home in such a world, because my room is easily exchangeable for your room, whereas my home is not exchangeable for your home. Your home is as precious to you as my home is to mine, right? So that specificity and uniqueness of the home as something which human beings need for a good life, for a free and happy life, and creative and loving life, that is increasingly out of fashion in this kind of modernity, which is trying to hotelize the whole civilization. And we now live, therefore, more in home equities than in home, to use the language of finance. So my home is worth $5 million, therefore it's worth more than your home, which is only $1 million, right? That sort of mentality is very deep today. So Ecosophy revolts against that.
Professor, as you said, this is sort of a dialogue. So I have one question that I would really like to ask you. You said that ecosophy is wisdom of the earth. It's reconnecting with the notion that earth is our home. But right now, due to climate change and global warming, the face of this earth is changing every second. The face of our home is changing every second. So how do you think that ecosophy can keep up with this ever-changing outlook of what the earth is, of what our home is? And how do we connect with that idea?
Well, think of a house first. Think of something simpler first, which is the house in which you live. Now, you have a duty to maintain this house, right? You have a duty to clean the house every day, to paint it once every year at Diwali or something, right? To wash the driveway, to water the lawn, etc. There is a certain building and maintenance you have to do of your house. The same way, you have to take care of the earth, right? On a much larger scale, of course. But there are large areas of the earth, if not the whole earth, where human beings have intervened, and intervened rather irresponsibly. Go and blow up a mountain with dynamite. Go and put sonar in the ocean, Go and pollute the oceans with oil spills, right? Who is going to clean all this up? Who is going to prevent the dirtying of it next time? All that involves a certain care and responsibility for the earth, if you see it as home. If you see it as a hotel room, then you trash it. The janitor of the hotel will come and clean it. Some third world worker from Tamil Nadu or Karnataka will be rushed in to clean the dirt in Norway and America. That's the way you effectively think, if you think of it as a hotel, right? So if you start looking upon the earth as home, then we have a cosmic responsibility to keep the earth hospitable, not only for future generations of humanity, but for future generations of plants and animals too, because we have a disproportionate responsibility as being creatures of, greater consciousness to actually not only reduce our footprint and the damage we do to the earth, but also to actually contribute to the ecological regeneration of the dying planet or the dying home. So that's the way it has to be done. And it's not a small task. At the same time, it's probably the most important task right now before humanity. If we had undertaken this task, the coronavirus wouldn't be here. The coronavirus is here because we disturbed the remote ecosystems first. We came too close to microbes which inhabit species which have a right to have their own ecological niches. You steal their ecological niches, then those viruses which are disturbed from there will come for you, which is what has happened. Just like when we disturb the Adivasi areas of Chhattisgarh, those tribals will come and find residence in Bangalore or Delhi. And then you're going to send the police after them saying, we have to win the war against the tribals, just like we're trying to win the war against the virus. So there's a little bit of imagination lacking here.
Moving on to the next question. The post-industrialized world primarily believes that development is technologically bound with instant material satisfaction. This notion compromises the very relationship between humans and nature. How does this new chapter of human history affect both the environment and development? And when I say development, I mean both in terms of the national GDP as well as individual intellectual growth.
See, if we want to understand what's happening right now, you have to go back about 200, 250 years to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Because it's the spread of industrialization primarily across the earth, beginning from Europe and North America, later Japan, and finally Asia, which has actually brought on the ecological crisis. So what has made things worse is that since 1945, since the end of World War II, the world is in a phase of what is called the Great Acceleration. Okay, the Great Acceleration refers to an exponential growth in the consumption of just about every possible resource. Right? Now, there are reasons why this is happening. Number one, you have growing population. On the surface, that seems to be the primary cause, right? But if you put everybody shoulder to shoulder and you give them like 1 square meter each, of space, do you know how much land they would occupy? I'll give you 4 options. The whole landmass of India, the state of California, the island of Sri Lanka, and Long Island. These are your 4 options. What is the area that all the peoples of the world, all the population of the world will occupy between these 4? Take a guess.
I think it would be the island of Sri Lanka.
Well, the right answer is Long Island. So that's how few people there are on Earth, actually. But we spread ourselves large, right? And we colonize and leave our footprints in many, many continents. All of us are now using things from every continent, from every ocean, and so on. Now, so in other words, it's not just about numbers of people, it's about what they do, what they produce, what they consume, how they live, and importantly, what technologies they use, right? You can have more or less resource intensive technologies, right? For instance, you can have, if 50 people have to be taken from point A to point B, you can give them 50 cars, 4 wheels each, or you can put the 50 of them in a bus, and on the same 4 wheels, they go much cheaper from point A to point B. They just have to coordinate a little bit. So public transport, therefore, efficient public transport, which is not difficult at all to attain, is entirely possible for all humanity, but giving every person a single car is going to cause traffic jams everywhere. I mean, China, a few years back, I don't know whether you know, had a traffic jam which was 100 kilometers, I think, or more long. And it took over 100 days to sort out. You know, they opened shops by the highway to sort out the traffic jam. That's development, that's progress. That's because of industrialization and because of hyperconsumption. Right? I mean, if all the people in the traffic jam had two-wheelers or were traveling on public transport, this wouldn't happen. Or, as they used to do in China in the past, travel on bicycles for long distances also, this wouldn't happen, right? So, so clearly, beyond population, we have to look at patterns of production and consumption. And those have been, like I said, on an exponential, curve upwards since 1945. Everybody now lives in America. I don't know why we bother to have so many countries, because everybody is effectively an American and wants to live the American dream of material success and, more and more economic growth and prosperity. If that is how we want to do things, and as one corporate executive said 10, 15 years ago, I think he was the CEO of Air Deccan, and I remember reading in the flight, he says, my goal is to make every Indian fly. Now, right now, some 10% of Indians can fly at best, right? Maybe less. Imagine if 100% of Indians were able to fly. Where are you going to get the oil, the planes, the airports, the space? You'll have a mess, and the world will be an ecological disaster. So just as well that every Indian is not flying. The answer is not for the poor to be brought to consumption levels of the rich, but the rich to reduce their consumption levels rationally to sustainable levels. Just like there is a poverty line, some people believe there should be an upper limit to consumption. There should be a high consumption line, which should not be allowed to be exceeded, but which we are exceeding all the time. Each of us in a conversation like this probably has an ecological footprint between 15 and 20 times that of the rickshaw pullers on the street. Okay, so 15 of them or 20 of them is consuming as much as one of us is consuming, right? So it's not just the numbers of people, but what they consume, right? And the third thing which makes a difference is technology. So like I said, automobiles are inefficient compared to buses, bicycles are the best, at least for short distances. But those are not the dreams of people, except for those who are environmentally correct and have values, like that. But by and large, for most people, they would like to have a car, and then a bigger car, and then a Mercedes, and then a sports car, and so on, an SUV. And so the way the aspirations are set up, it's as though we have only material aspirations and no other. And this relates to the second part of your question, which is, how do we understand development, right? Now, the way this might be understood is if I ask you a question. So let's say there are two countries, A and B. Country A looks like this. It has, and the populations are the same, 50 million, 100 million, whatever number you want. In country A, everybody gets 3 square meals a day, man, woman, and child. Everybody has good health care, doctors, medicines, nurses, hospitals. Everybody gets a decent education up to secondary level, if they want, up to college level. Everybody has, a sense of security, stability. What else? All the basic needs are fulfilled. Whatever one might think of as basic needs: clean air, clean water, clean food, pesticide and chemical free, all that. Country A. What it does not have are expressways, airports, skyscrapers, shopping plazas, tourist visits to the moon, and so on. Country B has all those things, but for a small number of people, maybe 20% or 30% of the people, and for the rest, there are many who are starving or barely able to make ends meet. Which of the two countries is likely to be called developed by, economists, policy experts, or by the general public? Which of the two?
Country B.
Country B, right? Country B is likely to be called more developed, even perhaps according to the Human Development Index, simply because it has such a high rate of growth, such a high per capita income that will outweigh the downsides, the low literacy rates or the low, healthcare or whatever, expensive healthcare, not affordable for most people. So this is the problem, that development has come to be understood largely as material aspiration. Any intellectual or cultural or creative or spiritual or social aspiration, for instance, good relationships between people, good, strong communities, it is not part of the definition or understanding of development in theory or practice, right? Communities have been eroded throughout modern life for 5 centuries. Wherever modernity reaches, the first victim is actually community, and it's replaced by what is called individual freedom. But after a while, the individual realizes that half their lives, that is to say, their public life, is controlled and surveilled by the state. And their private life, that is to say, their lives on the screen, is auctioned off to corporations. Social media companies, Google, they basically regulate your private life. So what you have is a situation in which everybody's focus is on material aspects, is not on emotions, it's not on relationships, it's not on spiritual life, culture. Those are not the priorities. So those things have obviously suffered. And that has a large part of responsibility for the ecological crisis, because the kind of alienation it has generated in the world, the kind of competitiveness it has sustained in the world, makes everybody wants to have bigger homes and bigger cars than their neighbor. Instead of bonding with your neighbor and creating strong communities, you break communities and you start going towards material fulfillment of material desires, and you compound problems. So the metaphor which I like to give is that we are all like cars racing on a gigantic sinking ship. The ship is so large that its edges are not visible from most places. And we are racing on this ship. And the ship is sinking. And the faster we race, the more the decks burn, and the faster the ship will sink. But we cannot see it because we are on that. We are the ship in some ways. So that's, I hope that answers your question, but I'll be happy to take any further questions on the same lines.
I think we can move on to the next question because it's also loosely based on that and can be seen as a follow-up question, which is basically that human societies have been unequal in some way or the other, as you illustrated in country A and country B. They have their own inequalities and things like that. The most pertinent of which is the economic divide. And in the 21st centuries, there have been many widespread initiatives to bridge these inequalities and progress towards a more ideal and a more utopian kind of a society. What will be the impact of ecological crisis on these kinds of initiatives? Will it actually bridge this gap, or will it further widen it?
Well, the short answer is the latter. But let me try to explain why I say that. So, if you have a very unequal society of the kind that India is right now, for instance, or Brazil, for instance, or South Africa, all these are very unequal societies. I'm staying with my parents during this COVID period, and the footprint of this household, where 3 of us live, would be the equivalent of about, I would say, anywhere from 50 to 100 households in in a basti or a slum in the city. That's the extent of inequality with which we are living. Now, what's the problem with this as far as ecology or environment are concerned? Let's look at it. look at it from the point of view of the countryside, where people are much poorer and much worse off than people in the city. Now, when you are poor, you tend to be more careless and indifferent towards your environment. Okay, you don't have the luxury to not cut a tree, for instance, to not, spoil, water systems. You may be more casual with the soil, with the land, because you're trying to make ends meet, your priorities to survive, to feed your child, and so on, right? That's for the poor. For the rich in the city, are we likely to tackle air pollution at a collective level? Unlikely, because there are individual solutions being sold. This is part of the solutionism I was talking about earlier. What do we normally do with air pollution? We roll up our car windows, we turn the AC on, and we do internal circulation of the AC, and we seal ourselves into a bubble. What have we done with the coronavirus? We've created these bubbles and imposed lockdowns. Will you have the luxury of a lockdown if you were a daily wager? If you don't have accumulated wealth, how will you have a lockdown? So lockdown is basically focused protection for metropolitan liberal elites around the world. It ignores the rest of the population, right? The same idea applies with pollution, which is to say air pollution in cities is unlikely to be tackled because the problems are structural. They require structural answers, institutional answers. Government policies will have to change. Cars will have to be reduced on the street. You'll have to tax automobile makers and automobile users. You have to raise the price of gasoline, etc. All sorts of things which are very unpopular with middle classes and elites, right? We would rather find symptomatic cures and solutions to such problems, right? This is a result of inequality. Yeah? In a more egalitarian society, you would not do this, right? So you would not do this because you will know the cost of doing it, and you'll have to bear the cost of doing it. Here also, I mean, there's an air purifier in that room, right? That also costs something, but it'll cost us much more if we have to get rid of automobile transport from the household and start taking public transport. We don't want to do that. We don't want to use the metro. Nowadays, we have a good excuse also, COVID, and so on, right? For the poor, if they were less poor, if they had more resources, they would take better care of their vegetation, their rivers, their coastlines, their meadows, right? Not throw garbage everywhere, and so on, right? So in that sense, you can see how inequality exacerbates the ecological crisis. The danger is that there is an idea in biology and popular with much of social science also called lifeboat ethics. So what lifeboat ethics says is that the Earth is not a spaceship going from here to someplace in space. It's actually a lifeboat which is sinking. There's only so much room on the lifeboat. It can't carry 7 or 7.5 billion or 8 billion people. Population has to be reduced to 1 or 2 billion to be sustainable, right? These are people who would not look at their own levels of consumption, who would not like to critique their own technologies which have brought this about through massive use of resources, through blasting of oceans and mountains, and would rather reduce population. Now you see the problem. So the environmental crisis is sought to be solved by making inequalities worse, by actually getting rid of, say, 3/4 of the world population, maybe hatch some viruses in some country's lab, and then inject everybody who is not required with those viruses, and indirectly they will die and nobody will know why they died, or some such thing. Bioterror, right? So these are not unpopular ideas in some circles. These are discussed behind closed doors. So that's a way to tackle the ecological crisis, by exacerbating inequality again. Moreover, I would predict that supposing you succeed, that is to say you reduce the population this way to 1 or 1.5 billion people, the ecological crisis is not going to go away. Why? because the structural forces which are generating that crisis will continue to prevail even in that society. Even in that sort of a post-Malthusian society, you will still have competition. You will still have cars racing on a sinking ship. For a while, it will seem like you have solved the problem, and then the second and the third wave will come and remind you that you never solved it. You ran away from the problem. You see the problem? So that's how it is. And it's not that I'm a socialist. I'm actually not a socialist. I'm not a capitalist either, but I'm certainly not a socialist. Now, I do believe, however, that a measure of equality in the wealth levels of people is required for a healthy society and for a sustainable economy. If Jeff Bezos has $200 billion, why would he care about his footprint? Why would his kids grow up in with the mentality that they have to reduce their footprint? They would go on private jets from place A to place B. And if he's the role model for the world and its aspirational classes, why would anybody care, right? You will say, well, Bezos does it, everybody else follows him. Why should I be the sucker in the pack? I would also therefore consume the same way. So that's how you create an ecologically irresponsible and irrational society, which is set to destroy itself over time. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Moving on to the next question. Various scholars such as Gandhi and Tagore had expressed convictions on the planetary crisis. What were some of these arguments, and how do these philosophies help us contextualize the present manifestations of climate change, such as change in the monsoon pattern in India?
Right. First of all, I want to say that looked at from this point of view, ideas that Gandhi or Tagore had were not as different from each other as some intellectuals portray them. They had differences over their attitudes to mass politics. For instance, Gandhi believed in mass politics in order to free India from British rule. Tagore did not, and they had different attitudes there. But in a large number of areas, especially when it concerns our relationship to the natural world, their views are all but identical. Gandhi, both Gandhi and Tagore actually notice as far back as the first decade of the 20th century that there is a serious problem with modernity and its relationship to the natural world. Tagore, in fact, is writing about it in the 1890s itself, right? At that time, nobody in the West was seriously worried about the ecological crisis. Nobody had heard of it for the most part. The West starts thinking about ecological crisis in the post-war period with books like Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962. There is a big smog event in London and also in LA in the 1950s. And not until the 70s that you have the Stockholm Conference, 1972 famous conference about 50 years ago. Next year would be the 50th anniversary, where the West for the first time wakes up to the fact that humanity is fouling its nest. Modern humanity, rather, is fouling its nest. Now, just think that 70, 80 years before that, at least 3 generations before that, Gandhiji and Gurudev were talking about ecological problems, right? In Hind Swaraj, which is Gandhi's premier text, it's the most important thing he wrote. He described modern civilization as a 9 days wonder. He says this civilization is so destructive that you just have to leave it alone and it shall collapse of its own inner contradictions and its own dynamic, that it's satanic. Now, people don't like these opinions, but when you look at the facts, they are much more with Gandhi than with people who don't like his opinions, right? So, he was fully aware of what industrial civilization was doing. He warned India. Remember, Gandhi dies in the first year of Indian independence. But I think sometime in the 30s, he writes an article in Young India, in which, I think it's in Young India, he says that God forbid that India should take to industrialization in the manner of the West. A small nation like Britain to industrialize had to colonize the whole planet. If India was to industrialize along the same lines, it would strip the earth bare like locusts, right? That is Gandhi's image. So he knows what industrial society will do because of competitive, destructive forces of accumulation and growth and waste and so on. Rabindranath writes repeatedly from the 1890s onwards. I'll draw your attention to one particular tract which hardly anybody quotes from, called Robbery of the Soil, which he writes in 1922 when he's setting up a place called Sriniketan next to Shantiniketan in Bengal, from where he conducts experiments in sort of swaraj, local production of food, of handicrafts, generation of livelihood, cooperative enterprises, right? And Robbery of the Soil is a tract in which he talks about how unequal the relationship between the city and the village has been and continues to get worse and worse. And he says the city has become predatory on the village and is causing all sorts of havoc, ecological havoc in the countryside, which people who have nothing to do with the cause of those problems have to bear the consequences. And those who are generating those problems, they are not even aware that they're causing these problems. I mean, for instance, you have big dams today, some 5,000 large dams in India. Do you think it's meant for villagers, or do you think it's meant for people like us in the cities? Most of the electricity that is being generated there is being transmitted on the grid to Bombay, Calcutta, Chennai, Bangalore, right? Rabindranath writes a very interesting play in 1922 called Muktadhara. And the story of the play is that there is a mountain stream, there's like a waterfall, and there is a baby who is abandoned by that mountain stream. And that baby is adopted by the royal family and is raised as the crown prince, right? His name is Abhijit. As he grows up, he, keeps visiting that stream every day. He plays with butterflies and pebbles. When he's a young man of about 18 or so, he realizes something sinister, which is that his father, the king, wants to build a dam across the stream and gets the world's most sophisticated engineer. I think his name in the story is Yantraraj, the king of machines, to come and build this dam. And he is devastated. He then realizes that building the dam is blocking the water to the valley, and the villages in the valley are upset that they can't grow their crop. So he gets together with them, and their leader is a man called Dhananjay. And one day Dhananjay and Abhijit go and they use I forget what it is, a piece of metal, I think, and they break the dam at its base. The water gushes out and it takes them, they sacrifice their lives and the dam is destroyed, right? Rabindranath writes this in 1922, and interestingly enough, the first large dam in India is built right after then in Mulshi in Maharashtra. And that dam still stands, supplies power and water to Bombay and Pune. It was protested by Senapati Bapat, who is a famous Gandhian leader. Mulshi Satyagraha, you can Google it. There's a book on it now. Ram Guha has reviewed that book in a newspaper. Rabindranath writes this story which sort of presages the trajectory that development takes place, that development takes in India over the next 100 years till the present, right? So clearly he was foreseeing what industrial society is going to do, not just to the psyche, but to the natural world of this country, right? These ideas are not taught by and large, as far as I'm aware. Gandhi and Tagore are like icons. You take their pictures and you put them on the wall. You put them over there where nobody will see it, or everybody will see it, but nobody will do anything except, worship it and then forget all about it. When we start looking at the ideas of the father of the nation, and this, Rabindranath is probably the uncle of the nation, right? You look at their ideas and they are extremely radical from today's perspective. So therefore you don't teach them. It's dangerous for kids to learn about Hind Swaraj. I read Hind Swaraj at the age of 34. You kids are lucky that you're hearing about it at say 17. I wish somebody had told me about Hind Swaraj at 17. So all the ideas that you need for an ecological change of a radical sort today, which is required of humanity just to survive, let alone to live a good life. Those changes are required. An ecological revolution is needed. Otherwise, we are toast in a few generations. All those ideas are there with Gandhi and Rabindranath. The problem is they are not palatable. Economists will not know how to keep their jobs if they take those ideas seriously. Nobody will invite them to government meetings and so on, right? So policies are going north and their ideas are going south. As far as they are concerned, policies are progress, going towards the moon, Mars, and they're saying, no, 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 get back down to earth, get real, folks. You're dreaming, you will have a nightmare very soon, and you will collapse in the dream. And Gandhi says this, if you go to Wardha, if you go to Sevagram, the Wardha ashram, there is a board, kind of a poster, it's a metal board on which is this quote called The Mad Rush, in which Gandhi talks about the restlessness of modern cultures and how it breeds instability of the soul and how it leads to excessive consumption and how one day we will wake up to the fact that we had gone mad, that this is insane. But when everybody is going mad, who is going to call the bluff, right? And the guy who is sane is going to be thought of as mad by the insane, right? But that's the kind of fate that Gandhi suffers today. If you look at an important correspondence between Gandhi and Nehru in October of 1945, they exchanged letters. And Gandhi writes to Nehru that now that India is about to become independent, I would like to share with you and the Congress party and with the people at large that I have not given up my dream of Swaraj, that I think that the only way that India and the world can live happily in the future is if most people actually live in small places and villages. If you have too many large cities, you will create violence, you will create unease, and you will destroy civilization. He writes in this vein. And Nehru replies after a few days saying, Bapu, what are you talking about? The world has changed in these 36 years that you wrote Hind Swaraj. We now have science. We are sending, exploratory spaceships into space. The world has gone so far and you want to take us back. This will not fly, this sort of thing. And at the end of the letter, Nehru says something interesting. He says, but maybe you are right. Maybe you are right. But what option do we have? He doesn't say he doesn't have the imagination to see what Gandhi is seeing. He doesn't have that humility. He merely says, what option do we have except to fall in line with the Western world and commit all the white man's blunders and take pride in development and progress, which is why we have reached this point and now we face the virus. So you didn't listen to listen to Gandhi, now you listen to the virus. But you still don't learn. You think you're going to defeat the virus. You're going to eradicate the virus. Other than anything else, that's bad biology. You can't eradicate viruses. What you can do is control the infection. That's not the same thing as eradicating the virus. The viruses are infinitely more primitive than humanity and will outlast humanity after we've gone too. So you see the whole framework in which Gandhi and Tagore were thinking was so remarkably different. And if you study them carefully, and there's volumes and volumes there to read, and almost none of them you'll be learning in school or college, right? You'll have to do it on your own because that's the corruption of the education system. Let me say a little bit about that because the colonization of education is a large part of the reason why we are facing these problems. Had we had a chance to interact with these ideas from kindergarten till now, we wouldn't be facing these problems, right? So there is a whole decolonization of the mind that's required to recover one's own imagination, autonomous of the way the global mind is working today. Because the global mind is trying to take us to the moon as if everybody can go there. So mad dreams offered by mad scientists, and they're very talented people. They're not stupid, they're very smart. That's why they're trying to build a smarter planet. Smartness is one thing, reality and wisdom another thing. They may be smart, but they're not wise. So I call them smart fools. So that's how the world is set up.
Professor Singh, since you spoke about ideas and Gandhi, we are all Macaulay's children in a sense. You know, we are all poorly educated, though we claim to have fancy degrees and things like that, and we haven't actually come across Gandhian ideas of philosophy in our everyday school textbooks, in a sense. But coming from a family of extremely well-educated and well-read individuals, and who are Gandhians, in fact, we have the 100 um, book collection of Gandhi, all his writings, and even being a great admirer of Ram Guha and having read most of his work. And I know what Ram Guha also thinks about democracy in a sense. You know, since we are talking about ideas, democracy itself has deep roots, perhaps say in Athens or even in India, 2,500 years ago, even in the Harappan civilization, we claimed to have democracy. And since ecosophy is a very solution-minded discourse, how do you think that, you know, we living in a democracy, or say in the current trajectory that democracy is going globally, do you think that can contribute to the solution-minded thing of which ecosophy is actually
Okay,
based on?
let me first offer a small correction to what you said. Ecosophy is not solution minded. It's not that it's not solution minded either. It doesn't look at things that way. It wants to first understand the causes of problems. You see, if you study mathematics, one thing which becomes clear is you can't solve a math problem properly unless you understand it. Understanding the problem is more than half the solution by itself. If you don't understand the problem, you might just get the right answer for the time being, but next time somebody gives you a similar problem, you may not be able to solve it, or a slight variation on the old problem, and you won't be able to solve it because you've not understood what the problem is. And you're simply applying a formula or a certain method mechanically, right? And that's not a good way to do mathematics. And likewise, with ecological problems or challenges, as I call them, uh, you you're obliged to understand why are these problems arising. If somebody has fever, before you pop a paracetamol, find out why the fever might have come. Is it a viral fever? Is it a typhoid fever? Is it a malarial fever? There may be different causes showing the same reading on the thermometer. And if you don't diagnose it, you will give the wrong medicine. For instance, I've suffered from it. I once had malaria. I knew I had malaria because it was the 5th time I had malaria. I knew the symptoms. I was trying to tell the nurse and the attendant in the hospital, please do the blood test because this is malaria. And they were treating me for typhoid, and, because they did some Vidal test and said this is positive, etc. And they assumed that, it can't be malaria, but I actually had malaria. So my point is that a good diagnosis is irreplaceable. Ecosophy believes in a good, honest, clinical, dispassionate diagnosis, right? That's one point. The other point which is important to understand is, and this is where vocabulary becomes important, Swaraj is not the same as democracy, or rather, democracy is not the same as Swaraj, a point which Ram often misses in his books. So, for instance, Gandhi says in Hind Swaraj, parliaments are emblems of slavery. Repeat, parliaments are emblems of slavery. If he was a Democrat, he could not have said that clearly. So obviously, Swaraj is different from democracy, profoundly different. I mean, let me give you a few reasons why it's different. For instance, Swaraj puts a lot of emphasis on the individual's spiritual and moral autonomy. That is to say, it obliges the individual to work at changing themselves to the point where we are in command of our passions, that we are in sort of self-control from within. The spirit is all powerful and is able to control passions in the mind. That's not in democracy. Democracy says nothing about what the individual is to do. because that would be prescriptive and they wouldn't like to prescribe to individuals in the name of freedom as they understand it. Whereas Gandhi insists that your duties are actually more important than your rights, right? Your responsibilities are more significant than your rights. And that obliges you to change yourself. And you try to move inwardly towards a spiritual place, not to detach yourself from the world, in a real sense, but to actually take command of your feelings and your thoughts in such a way that you can actually contribute to the world in a better way. What Gandhi would call sarvodaya, which is very different from utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the greatest good of the greatest number. That's consistent with democracy and consumer democracy especially. All of economics rests on the idea of utilitarianism. All this aspirationalism is coming from there. But Gandhi would reject it. Gandhi would say this is a low life, this is a vulgar life, okay? And so he tried to draw the individual towards their own higher nature as he understood it, and tried to say that you need to understand that the fulfillment of desires is not going to bring you happiness. What is going to bring you happiness is giving to others, something which the West has rejected as altruism or something theoretically fanciful but not realistic about human nature, because people are fundamentally selfish. These are assumptions which have now become real. People have acted on these assumptions and then made them real, tragically. Gandhi was talking about sarvodaya. Sarvodaya is not the same thing as utilitarianism. Sarvodaya is about the collective awakening of everybody. Awakening, Uday is dawn, the rising sun, so that's the metaphor. So sarvodaya is that, and that is the way he thought of seva in swaraj. You perform service for others, to others, because that will make you also feel much better. The most miserable country I have seen in the world is the United States. The reason is because everybody is in a grab mode, in a very organized grab mode, so you don't notice the grabbing till, one day there's a power outage in New York and everybody just jumps into the supermarkets and takes everything that they can from there. So when you are taking all the time, you are not going to find happiness like that. You're not going to find meaning or value like that, right? No matter how successful you get. Success is not going to bring you happiness. Any number of successful people have committed suicide, continue to, including students. So what Gandhi is talking about is a swaraj which will liberate the individual and the community. Now, again, democracy has nothing to say about the community. Democracy is perfectly consistent with a complete absence of community as long as there's a strong state. So there's state, there's corporation, and there's the individual. And like I said, you segment the individual into two parts: the public life controlled by the state, the private life controlled by the corporation, the individual conspicuous by her absence in her own body, right? So we have to vacate ourselves so that the corporation and the state can colonize us in those two halves, right? So what Gandhi was saying was that this is a terrible way to live, to break down communities and families and liberate individuals from families and communities is a dangerous thing. And today we know that they liberated the individual from the family and the community to hand over the individual to the corporation and the state, right? The markets are growing. Okay, take a simple example of what I'm talking about. If as some feminists have argued, women should be paid for their household work, right? Supposing husbands who work and make income from outside start paying their housewives who are not working outside, for what they do. Do you think that is going to improve or deteriorate human relationships? Take a further example. If parents start charging children in retrospect for raising them to adulthood, right? After they turn 18, they say, okay, now you go fend for yourself. And the last 18 years, I've spent this much on your upbringing, I want it back. And over the next 18 years, you start paying the interest on what you borrowed from your parents. This will increase GDP because measured incomes would rise, but it's going to destroy society. In Japan, you have a booming relationship market now. You can rent a husband, you can rent a boyfriend, you can rent a mother-in-law, you can rent whatever you want. You know? So you can turn the society into an economy. You can replace society with social media and get high TRPs and good, ratings to generate huge revenues through advertising and destroy society completely. And in fact, I would argue that social media wouldn't have thrived without a broken society. You first break society, then you sell social media to people to connect them. So in other words, you first have to disconnect them and then you connect them. And then you connect them to 5,000 friends all over the world, but none of them can be with you when you really need them next to you, right? So these are ways in which the economy has come to colonize society, as it were, and colonize the life worlds of so many people. All this is consistent with democracy, as we are seeing, but is completely inconsistent with Swaraj, as Gandhi saw it, right? Also, there are kinds and kinds of democracy. Liberal democracy, I think it died an ignoble death on the evening of 9/11, hasn't recovered since then. Liberal democracy is in a comatose condition, especially after the Modi-Trump years. Now what you've got is totalitarian democracy, and increasingly a bio-totalitarian corpocracy. Government of the people, by the corporations, for the corporations. That's the game in town. Okay. So I don't know what Ram means when he says we've had democracy for 2,000 or 3,000 years. We had panchayats, we've had swaraj, we've had sarvasammati, we've had various modes of decision making, which are all locally rooted. And the local was extraordinarily rooted and powerful. Where is the local today? It's been completely vacuumed up by the global and turned into a totalitarian structure which lords over everybody. Okay? No Roman emperor had the power of our prime minister today. No Roman emperor had this kind of power. If this is what democracy is, then what is tyranny? I want to know that. So, I think these are very basic questions which need to be now faced, because the cost of not facing them might be our own collective lives.
And yet we seem to be implementing the central vista. So that's the irony,
So-
right? And yet we
Sorry?
also seem to be implementing the central vista right now. So that's the irony.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we just have about, again, 5 more minutes. So let's just start up with this question and then we can again rejoin our next society. So what would be your advice to the ambitious youth of this country who are, I think, being a teenager and mingling with most of my friends are leaning towards the material aspirations? What would be your advice to them who are also likely to face the brunt of climate change? And how do you think we should be handling it?
So I will first turn the question back to you and your friends. And, ambition is seen as a wonderful thing now, and it perhaps is, at least some kinds of ambition. But let's just follow through with a certain line of thought. So let me ask you, what sum of money would you, this is the kind of question an economist would ask. Unfortunately, I was trained in economics. What sort of money would you need to say, this is more than enough for the rest of my life and perhaps my children and my grandchildren too, and I don't need to work? Name some sum of money which you think would be enough to take care of you, your family for the rest of your life and two more generations. Any sum of money you think would be enough.
In hard cash or other
Yeah,
forms of
in
it?
hard cash. It's on in hard cash. You don't have to wait. You can draw on it anytime. But to be sure, the investments are arranged in such a way that you won't be profligate and you won't throw it away. So you can draw a tranche, between now and the next 5 years, and then another one after that. Like, you have enough. What would that sum of money be in present value terms, according to you?
I would say at least about 1 crore.
1 crore. Okay.
Looking
Do you
at
have a different answer, Amruta?
I don't think any sum of money. I can't decide on any sum of money because it keeps on increasing. Like,
But still,
I can't.
I mean, 10 crores, 100 crores, 1,000 crores, you can name any sum of money you want.
Like 7 to 10 crores.
7 to 10 crores. Okay. Now what I do is I put 50 crores in each your accounts. Don't ask me where I got the money, but I put that sum of money in your accounts, 50 crores each. Now you say, okay, Oakridge is kind of a picnic. I mean, okay, I'll do my high school, I'll take my IB, I'll get my diploma, and then I'll do what I feel like, right? That's my next question to you. What is it that you feel like? If you had complete freedom and there were no economic constraints and you didn't have to look for a job and worry about a career and write resumes and please bosses, what would you want to do with your lives?
easy answer. Flood my room with a pile of books. Just keep reading.
Okay. And you, Amrita?
I'd probably be doing the same. Buy a bunch of detective fiction and just drink coffee and read the entire day.
Good. So what I would say to you is, you know yourselves well enough to know what your aspirations are. Assume that you have the economic security and live as though you have the economic security and keep these ambitions and fulfill them. And they're perfectly harmless ambitions, especially if you borrow the books from a library and reduce the number of trees cut and so on, or you read them on Kindle, although that has complex ecological consequences. But what I mean to say is that material aspirations are an excuse most of the time, at least for middle class and elite people, to avoid doing what they would really like to do. You might want to go fishing, you might want to go trekking, you might want to learn the piano, you might want to meet friends, you might want to, serve people, whatever it is you want to do with a passion, something for which you have a sustained passion, you might want to do that. And you say you can't do it because you have to make a living, you have to worry about money and livelihood and so on. A lot of people, I'm not saying you necessarily, but a lot of young people say that. Since you asked me the question about young people, my experience is that people would say, by the time they reach 20 or 22, they say, if I don't get a job, my parents would be upset. And so I need to get a job. And so I can't, go trekking and fishing, And I would say to them, I think you're giving an excuse, it's true that your parents will be. First, make a simple distinction between material aspiration and what shall we call it? I don't want to say just non-material aspiration. I want to say something like deeper aspiration or higher aspiration. Because, everybody needs to eat, but the purpose of life cannot be eating. We live not to eat, but eat in order to live. Consumer society has it wrong side up, which is to say we live to eat. We live just for pleasure, material gross pleasure rather than any higher pleasure. So, distinguish between material aspiration and a deeper aspiration. That's one. Do not reject material needs, because material needs are there. But needs means water, not Coca-Cola and thumbs up, right? You want to give yourself medical problems when you are middle-aged, or you want to stay healthy. If you want to stay healthy, then think of needs, not desires, right? You need clean air. You don't need polluted air. You need, simple, ecologically healthy modes of transport. So therefore, think about all those things. What are you consuming? Why are you consuming these things? Do you really need to consume these things? Or are you doing it to impress your friends because they are consuming those brands? And unless you wear Levi's or whatever brand your friends are wearing, you're not accepted by the group. That's a very different problem. It's not about need. It's about desire. There's a psychological issue here. So aspirational consumption is the problem. Material need is not the problem. So once you've distinguished between that and you are able to think of a way to meet your material needs, which are actually very finite, then think about what you would want to do. Ideally, why were you born? You know, what is the purpose of your life? Why do you exist? I mean, obviously you enjoy something. You were created for a purpose. Some people are meant to sing. Other people are meant to play cricket. Yet other people are meant to paint a good painting. Do that, because that's what you're meant to do, and you'll be happy. Once we are at peace with what we are doing, we are happy. And we'll not be at peace if we avoid what we are meant to do. Now, this takes effort, because first of all, you have to discover yourself, which is never easy, because society has colonized us. The economy has colonized society. So effectively, the economy has colonized us. Okay. So effectively, it's the advertisers every evening on TV who are telling you, you need this kind of a water purifier, you need this kind of a, deodorant, you need this kind of a car, etc. And that will make you a good Amrita, a much better Amrita. Problem begins right there. Why do you think they're spending billions on advertising? They're not idiots. They're spending billions on advertising because people need to be manipulated to buy the products which they wouldn't buy otherwise. Food doesn't have to be advertised. People will find food. I mean, simply because we are animals with intelligent instincts, so we will find food. Why does food have to be advertised? The advertising of food begins in America 100 years ago. Before that, throughout human history, humanity has evolved without advertising. Completely wasteful activity and totally redundant. Okay, but it creates human beings now. You are being raised not by your parents, not by your teachers, but by the marketing divisions of global multinational corporations. Facebook, Amazon, Google, Instagram, Twitter, these are your parents today. Now, if you're happy with that, fine. It seems most people are happy with that and they call themselves educated. Good luck to you. I don't think you are set for much happiness if you accept them as parents, and if you forget your real parents, and if you forget your real teachers, and if you fail to learn from what life has to teach, because it has to teach a lot. The point is, once you are able to see all this, then you will know that your deeper aspiration is for something else. It may be love, it may be happiness, it may be peace, it may be cooperation, whatever. And that should become the fulcrum of your life. Then you would have lived a fulfilling life. And when you leave this world, you'll die very happy, because it's important to die happy and not cry about too much. Let other people do the crying. But when you leave, you should be happy. So you won't be happy if you've not lived according to your true instinct and what your soul always wished to do, right? So that's all I will say, that ambition is not a bad thing, provided it's directed at the soul and at the liberation of the soul in the best sense of the word. Otherwise, the same ambition turns towards material things and it becomes a curse. First for the individual, then for others, and ultimately for the individual again. That's the wheel of life. That's the sort of law of karma, as it were, that works on all of us, and nobody is exempt from that.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think those are all the questions that we have.